Good afternoon. I'm so excited to have all of you with us today at this lecture, and I'm going to start by introducing my colleague, Beth Burgess, Director of Collections and Research at the Stowe Center. Beth, hi, will you start us off?
Love to, Amy. Thanks, everyone. My name is Beth Burgess. I'm the Director of Collections and Research here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Hartford, Connecticut. Again, thank you all for joining us today for this panel presentation, Understanding Katharine S. Day's Identity, Interpreting Sexuality in Early 20th Century New England. This program was funded by a grant from Connecticut Humanities and a donation by Anne Standback and Charlotte Kinlock. Thank you. The Stowe Center preserves and interprets Stowe's Hartford home and the center's historic collections, promotes vibrant discussion of her life and work, and inspires commitment to social justice and positive change. So museum founder Katharine Seymour Day's history is all around us here on site, and her collected antiques, including those of her great aunt Harriet Beecher Stowe, her prolific artwork with which we decorate our offices, her personal papers, and even the historic building I'm sitting in today is named for her. While staff over the decades has studied Day as an artist, a preservationist, an urban development activist, her personal life has never fully been explored. Perhaps it was too recent, too soon to her death to really have been taken on by the early museum. I've always wondered if she had romantic relationships and knew that the answer may be found in Day's collections. It was Sam Dinney, who's with us today. So Sam, please wave. Who, as a research fellow during the spring of 2021, first dug through archival boxes of letters, diaries, sketchbooks, and photographs, pinpointing evidence in what ended up being 33 items. Sam's accompanying research report was the beginning to what we knew could expand into site-based museum interpretation. Luckily for us, LGBTQIA+ scholar Susan Ferrantinos was willing to work with us and grow the research project further. We're excited to hear her findings today. While this research is funded to date, it is not funded to continue, and so donations are encouraged during and after this program. Please follow the link that'll be in the chat. And lastly, this program is being recorded and will live in our multimedia gallery on the center's website, harrietbeecherstowecenter.org, if you want to revisit or share news with others about this program. Amy?
Thank you so much, Beth.
Of course.
I'm the Director of Programs and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center, and working collaboratively with Beth Burgess in Collections is the most amazing part of my job. So this program really does come out of both of our sort of investigations into how to both do great research and also how to work with audiences around different topics. So as we begin today, let's acknowledge that we are bringing to this program from Indigenous lands. We are on the Indigenous lands, and the people here predate the Dutch and the English arrival, even though that's the history that we then pick up on. We are on Indigenous land that is all Algonquin speaker related to the Wongonk in particular. And as we travel this land, we want to recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of the people today into future generations. We offer this with humility and gratitude today in acknowledgement of the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and its impact. So that said, we'll move from there into just general housekeeping news. We ask that people do keep in their, sorry, I'm letting people in and talking, never a good combo. Ask that people use their mute during the program, please. The chat is not activated except to me. So if there are people that you want to be in conversation with or to ask questions, that has to come to me, and Sam, I will be forwarding things to you when appropriate. As Beth said, we are recording this program. It will come to live on the multimedia gallery at the Stowe Center. Encourage everyone to visit that location where so much of our programming is archived, and there's so many really interesting talks and podcasts there. So the mission of the Stowe Center is the interpretation of Harriet Beecher Stowe's life and collection, and the way in which her work relates to contemporary conversations around social justice and positive change. But today we begin really for the first time a transition to interpreting more formally the work of Catherine Seymour Day and the way it fits into our larger collection and preservation story. And we wanted to do that not alone in our own little bubble of the Stowe Center. We wanted to do that in collaboration with colleagues who we recognize and know are doing great work in this field around New England. And so what I'm going to do is introduce our 4 speakers today and then just begin the program. And we will be, again, sharing news with you at the end of the program with more links and a link to a survey, right? Because while our funders love to know what I think about what happens at a public program, they really love to know what you all think about what happens at a public program. And the program will last about an hour and a half. We're going to end at 1:30. That gives time for a robust conversation. So each of the speakers will be speaking for between 15 and 20 minutes for your interest. So Shalyn Omeo is a public engagement manager at Connecticut Landmarks, including the Palmer Warner House in East Haddon, Connecticut. And she's interpreting the relationship between Frederick Palmer and his partner, Howard Mertzger, from the mid-20th century. And we will start with Shalyn, but let me introduce again all of the other speakers. Marilyn Keith Daly joins us as the project manager for Historic New England Center for Preservation and Collections. And she's been working on the Sarah Orne Jewett House in South Berwick, Maine, and the interpretation between Jewett and Annie Fields from the 19th century and their Boston marriage. Then we go on to Megan Giraldi Holmes, who comes to us as the curator from the Gibson House Museum in Boston, Massachusetts, who will interpret the museum's founder, Charlie Gibson Jr., and his queer life in the 20th century in Boston. Then on to our keynote speaker and the scholar who worked so closely with us at the Stowe Center, Susan Ferentinos, a public history researcher, writer, consultant, specializing in project management for historic organizations and LGBTQIA+ and women's history projects in particular. She's the author of Interpreting LGBT History at Museums and Historic Sites, a book that we think all should read and know about. And this book won the 2016 Book Award for the National Council of Public History. So really important sort of seminal text. So today you're going to hear from these multiple sites representing many different moments in historic time, different individuals from different geographies, and at these multiple points in development in the archive, right? So really the idea here is to show multiple stages in this kind of interpretive work in the field. And in design, we are encouraging our audiences to read the nuances of all these different variables at play in the work. The idea is that by presenting all of these stories in sort of a conversation with each other, we are exposing a range of different interpretive strategies. So just to remind everyone, the questions we posed to ourselves as we started to design this program: how should historians interpret apparent LGBTQIA and historical relationships among people who did or did not self-identify? And how can museums design responsible guidelines for historical storytelling that encompass the complexity of suppressed and hidden histories, as well as the wishes of the subjects as we come forward? So I look forward to exploring all of this together with you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh dear, you all went away. So now I have to search for you, Shalyn. Oh, thank you for doing that. That's really excellent.
All right. So thank you, Amy, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, Amy, it says that screen sharing is prohibited. I do have some slides.
There you go.
Okay. All right. So hello, my name is Shaylin Ameo, and I work with Connecticut Landmarks on education and interpretation for our statewide network of historic house museums that span 400 years of New England history. One of our properties is the Palmer Warner House in East Haddam, and it is one of the first historic house museums in the state to have a primary interpretation focusing on LGBTQ history. So there she is. That's the Palmer Warner House. It's a 1738 center chimney colonial house built by John and Mehitable Warner. They primarily used money and property from Mehitable's inheritances. She had several inheritances and they made their home in East Haddam based on that. Later generations of the family were known locally for their blacksmithing work. There are actually examples of their hardware inside the house and outside the house. You can see that ring on the front door there is actually a Warner design. Some of them are original to the house and some of them were collected by Frederick Palmer, who we will learn a little bit more about today. Originally, the house was sited on 1,000 acres of land that stretched all the way to the Connecticut River. In 1936, Frederick Palmer, a preservation architect, purchased the house with his mother, Mary Brennan Palmer. Here is a 1934 aerial photo that shows the property just before he purchased it. The house, barn, and carriage house are in the yellow circle, and the 50 acres that Palmer purchased are outlined in the green rectangle. The black cross that you see kind of in the center is about as far as the view shed extends today from the back porch. So here's just a zoomed in version where you can see the house in the orange circle and the barn and carriage house attached to it in the green circle. So when Palmer and his mother purchased the property in 1936, he was pleased to find, quote, a house that had nothing changed in it since 1790. He then went on to add 3 bathrooms, several closets, a modern kitchen, plumbing, central heating, and window caps. He also moved the back staircase and removed the walls to the so-called boarding room. So Frederick is part of the early 20th century colonial revival restoration movement. And so he felt that any house that he was going to live in should preserve, yes, the idea of how things were in the colonial period, but also should really work for how he wanted to use the house in that moment and what was trendy in 1936. So we also know that in the 1940s, he painted the house red, right? In that 1934 photo, it was white. And we know that he painted it red exactly when, because he kept meticulous scrapbooks that were organized by themes where he documented changes he made to the house. So you'll have a page that shows that photo that I just showed from 1934 of the exterior, right next to one from 1936, from 1938, right? Like it just keeps going. And that is true for everything from exteriors to interiors, the way he had furniture arranged in rooms, and then to more mundane subjects like pets. Okay, and so who is Frederick Palmer? This is actually his birth announcement from 1901. Oh, ain't he cunning, Montville, Madonna and Childs. And so he was born in 1901 to a wealthy family that had lived on the Connecticut coast since 1640. He studied architecture at Harvard University, where he was the class of 1925. And after graduation, he assisted architectural historian Kenneth John Conant at the Cluny excavation in France. He returned to the United States in 1935, where he was a sought-after preservation architect. His work included the restoration of the 1876 Goodspeed Opera House, also in East Haddam, now nationally known as the home of the American musical. If you've been in the Opera House and seen the very ornate green staircase in the front entry, that's Frederick. He also worked on the 1794 Congregational Church in East Haddam and a variety of projects on private homes. Frederick was also a trustee for the Antiquarian and Landmark Society, which was the predecessor organization for Connecticut Landmarks, where I work today. From 1944 to 1971, he was chairman of the Structures Committee. So these are Connecticut Landmarks Historic Properties. As I said before, they span 400 years of Connecticut history. And when we talk about Frederick, these are the properties that Frederick was involved with for us, either helping to acquire them or helping to restore them after we had them in our collection. So we have the 1711 Butt-Off Williams House in Wethersfield, the 1678 and 1759 Hempstead houses in New London, the 1776 Nathan Hale Homestead in Coventry. Those are all properties that he worked on to restore. And then the 1816 Amasa Day House in East Haddam and the 1782 Butler McCook House in Hartford were properties that he helped us acquire. And of course, Palmer Warner House. In 1945, 2 years after his mother passed away in 1943, Frederick Palmer met Howard Metzger through a mutual friend, Jack Pierce. It is our understanding that Frederick and Howard had both been romantically involved with Pierce, and Palmer was consoling Metzger about Pierce's behavior. He was a bit of a cad. Metzger was from Ohio and served in the U.S. Merchant Marine during World War II. Several months after meeting Palmer, Metzger joined Pierce in having his own room at Palmer's house in East Haddam. So this photo of Howard in his Merchant Marine uniform, very dashing. He's wearing a signet ring that we think that he actually gives to Frederick at one point because Frederick writes about it in a letter. And then here is a photo of Metzger and Palmer in front of the house that was taken the year they met. Between 1945 and 1948, Palmer wrote hundreds of letters, one nearly every day, to Howard Metzger. While Metzger was at sea, where letters were read by censors, Palmer mostly wrote about daily life. It would have been dangerous if someone suspected Metzger were gay. Palmer would sometimes vary the postmark on his letters, so it wasn't obvious that Howard was receiving so much correspondence from one man. Metzger did scold Palmer on a few occasions for getting too personal in his letters. In a July 1945 letter, Palmer wrote in response, "Gosh, I wish I could write some few of the things I really want to say, but it would be such a relief to be able to let go and get some of it off my mind." When Metzger was on land, usually in New York City awaiting another assignment, the two were free to speak more freely. In a letter from December of 1945, Palmer wrote that he was the one person whose love and devotion Howard could count on until the end of time. Though Jack Pierce did not stay at the house in East Haddam long-term, Howard Metzger did. Metzger and Palmer deliberately curated their house with items they inherited and collected together. Furnishings include American furniture from the colonial, Victorian, and colonial revival periods, decorative arts, silver, clocks, paintings, and portraits. So some of the things you might expect in a historic house. However, the collection also includes the couple's extensive record collection stored in the old kitchen as seen here, which has a fascinating cross-section of their interests like opera, musicals, rock and roll from the 1960s and 70s. In the dining room where they hosted dinner parties, portraits of John and Charity Warner overlook the dozens of animal figurines that Howard collected. This upstairs bedroom was where Frederick's mother lived and later Howard's mother. We know that in part because there are perfume bottles from two very different eras in the highboy scene in the corner. So Palmer would work from the house drafting architectural drawings in the study, while Metzger spent time working on the gardens, including sculpting elaborate topiaria. So these are bunnies, but sometimes they were cats, sometimes they were frogs. They tended to kind of evolve over time, depending on what Howard was working on. They don't currently exist at the house, but we're trying to get them back. So stay tuned for that. They threw moonlit parties for their large circle of friends, many of whom were gay, where they could escape life and enjoy time with each other on the secluded property in East Haddam. So here are Howard and Frederick a little bit later in the 60s on their back deck. You can see it's quite lush. They really created an escape at their property in East Haddam. We do know that people in town knew that they were gay, right? They were out, knew that they were in a relationship together. However, not only were they personally conservative politically, They also knew that in the larger scope of the world, being gay put them at significant personal risk. So they did use their own status in town and their contributions to the local culture to kind of draw safety to them. In 1971, Frederick Palmer passed away. Howard Metzger continued to live in and care for the property in East Haddam until his own unexpected passing in 2005. Upon Metzger's death, the house was left in the care of Connecticut Landmarks. Since then, our collections team has been working to inventory and catalog objects in the house, understand documents in the archive, and research the lives of the house's last residents. So here are Frederick and Howard, or Howard on the left, Frederick on the right, shortly before Frederick's passing. So as is mentioned here, Howard actually was in great health when he passed away. He got in a car accident, and so it was not expected that he was going to pass away at that point, which means that the house had everything in it that was there the morning that he woke up and got in his car and drove out. And so there's a lot of things in the house. You can imagine, like I think about my own house, if I were to get up one morning and leave and not come back, how many items, just literal items there would be to go through. And that's what our collections team has been working on. So historic house museums, they've been declining in popularity since the bicentennial. And so it's become pretty unusual for a new one to open. So that might make you ask what happened with Palmer Warner. Frederick Palmer had begun to plan for the house to be left to Connecticut Landmarks as early as the late 1940s. His instructions specified that Howard would be able to live there until his death. This is not unusual for houses slated to become museums. Several of the houses in our collection had similar agreements in place with their last owners. Palmer was, as mentioned before, closely involved in Antiquarian and Landmarks, now Connecticut Landmarks. He often hosted events at the house for the organization. Here you can see a page from his scrapbook where he's noting what the setup was for an October 1957 open house and tour that they did for Antiquarian and Landmarks. He kept a guest book in his house where he asked anyone who he gave a tour to leave their comments. So this house really was a showpiece for him. He loved to show it off. He loved to have people through. So when we think about the collection at Palmer Warner, we have to think about what's in the archive. What do we have to draw on for sources? We have Palmer's architectural records. We have his diaries, his scrapbooks, and his correspondence. We also have Metzger's papers and his correspondence, although we have fewer of his items than of Palmer's. This house was really thought of as Frederick Palmer's house, and Howard Metzger took care of it with that in mind. And then we have some of Mary Brennan Palmer's diaries as well. Because of the unexpected nature of Howard Metzger's death and the longstanding agreement that the house would come into Connecticut Landmarks collection, we have the rare circumstance in which evidence of a same-sex relationship was not quote unquote cleaned up upon the death of its residents. My personal opinion is also that this has to do with Howard Metzger, who really maintained the house as a memorial to Frederick and the archive in his memory. Metzger's family only removed those items left to them in the will, which again, my personal opinion, probably has to do with the respect that they had for Howard's reverence for Frederick. So how have we been working on this since 2005? We've been using an iterative process, and we have the foundational view that this work will never be done, right? So we are not looking at this as something that we can finish and kind of tie up with a bow. We have been doing archival research, collections research. We've been getting scholarly input through scholars panels, conducting workshops and interviews with community members, presenting to the field. We've conducted oral history with residents of East Haddam, people who knew Frederick and Howard. And we've been doing surveys and focus groups to kind of try and understand where our audiences are in terms of understanding the larger arc of LGBTQ history and how a story like Frederick and Howard's may fit into that, and understanding what they're interested in. We believe, after all of this work, that the Palmer Warner House's most important interpretive value is in telling the story of mid-century LGBTQ life in Connecticut. So through the specificity of Palmer and Metzger's lives and work and relationship, we can make connections to larger arcs of LGBTQ history, historic preservation history, and social change. So we've developed a few interpretive themes. I'm just going to go ahead and read them because they're a little lengthy. Through Frederick Palmer's and Howard Metzger's relationship, we can tell the historically excluded story of a same-sex couple whose lives span the whole of the 20th century, with Frederick having been born in 1901 and Howard passing away in 2005, a period of dramatic change for LGBTQ Americans. Palmer's preservation work provides a rich cultural context for understanding the development and evolution of preservation work and attitudes in the 20th century, particularly the role that white upper-class gay men played in these changes. Metzger and Palmer negotiated their interlocking identities. They were privileged due to their race and class, while simultaneously marginalized due to their sexuality. So when we talk to museum professionals about this, this often begins a conversation about donor intent. While Frederick Palmer and Howard Metzger felt that the interest in the home would have more to do with its colonial pedigree and Frederick's position as an architect, they also wanted to show life in the 20th century. And we actually have a letter from Frederick Palmer to the director of the Antiquarian and Landmark Society in 1948, where he says, "It is not my purpose to leave a museum furnished as an example of life in the 18th century, but rather an 18th century house as lived in and used by a gentleman of the middle of the 20th century. I believe our modern conveniences will be as much curiosities in the 21st century as the tin tubs of the 18th are to us today." And really, we take the view that we can't treat donor intent as being beyond reproach. For instance, the Warners built a barn in about 1740. In about 1760, they doubled its size. It's now one of the oldest barns in the state, and Connecticut Landmarks has recently painstakingly restored it. Frederick Palmer and Howard Metzger used it to store their car collection. They cut 5 garage doors into its sides. They damaged the integrity of the structure. This is an example of the way in which our understanding of the importance of less glamorous structures like barns has advanced in recent decades. So too has our understanding of the importance of everyday life, particularly those that have been historically excluded. So how do you visit the Palmer Warner House? We're open by reservation, May to October. You can visit our website, ctlandmarks.org. And if you have any questions or want to chat about anything specifically, I put my email up there as well. So thank you, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Shaylin. And next up is Megan.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, well, thank you to Amy and Beth and to the Stowe Center for having me, and to my fellow presenters. Really delighted to be in conversation with you today. So my name is Megan Gilardi Holmes. I'm the curator at the Gibson House Museum. And here is the Gibson House. We are a small historic house museum in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. The house was home to 3 generations of the Gibson family between 1859, when the house was built, and 1954, when the last family member died. When I talk about the Gibsons, people always ask, like, were they famous and were they very important? And the answer is no. But what is special about the house is that we have all of their things in the place that they used and enjoyed them. So it's a really great time capsule of late 19th, early 20th century domestic life. The house opened as a museum in 1957, and we have been open ever since. Visitors primarily experience the house through a 45-minute guided tour, of which we have several on offer now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to the man of the hour, Charles Hammond Gibson Jr. We refer to him typically as Charlie. He was a member of that 3rd generation of Gibsons who lived in the house, born and died in the house. He was the last resident, and it was his project to turn the house into a museum. If there was one thing Charlie would want all of you to know about him, it was that he was a writer. So he published 2 travelogues, 2 collections of poetry, and our archives are filled with his unpublished work. Tons more poems, family genealogies, song lyrics. He was a gay man. He never married or had a long-term partner that we know of, but we do know a little bit about some of his relationships, and I'll talk about those briefly as we go. He was also a real Boston character. He was kind of stuck between his 19th century youth and the modern era. And I think this image of his study is a really great example of that. This was decorated in the 1930s, but it doesn't look like the 1930s at all. It really looks high Victorian. So in 1934, Charlie was 60 and he moved home to take care of his ailing mother. He had been living in rented rooms around the Back Bay. And he spent the remaining 20 years of his life in the house more or less alone. In 1936, he began the project of turning his family home into a museum, and his fingerprints are all over the place. So you've got to love a guy who puts himself in triptych above the mantelpiece in a very prominent room, or chooses to put a nude classical sculpture in the front hall. He wrote tours of different rooms in the house. He was really thinking about how to present it. He refers to himself in the third person in these tours. This is an example of one on the left. And I feel like all of these examples give you a little bit of a sense of his personality. His preservation work really threaded together several goals. He wanted this house to be a monument to his literary achievements. He wanted to burnish his family's legacy. Here's a man who's not leaving any children behind. He's not forwarding the Gibson family name, so this house might do that work. And, you know, this was a project of nostalgia. He was someone who was really looking back in time. By the time he had moved back home, Back Bay and Boston is changing dramatically, and his wealthy compatriots are moving out to the suburbs, and working class folks and students and people of color are moving into the city. And I think that was really destabilizing for Charlie. It was also, a project of looking back to a time when he was in his prime. In fact, I don't think you can understand any of this project without knowing that he was a gay man and sort of fitting his sexuality into the whole picture. So the museum's interpretation of this history has been uneven. In Charlie's lifetime, it was an open secret that he was gay. And in the history of the house as a museum staff always knew this story, but it wasn't always talked about. I will say that there have been scholars, museum professionals who have pushed this narrative forward and have been continuously thinking about it and writing about it. Trip Evans, Todd Gurnis, Ken Torino, all of them have been really instrumental in helping us kind of move this forward. And in 2018, we committed that every single visitor was going to hear Charlie Gibson was a gay man on a tour that they went on. And so I kind of excerpted a little bit of our tour script so you could see that. This was when we only had one tour. And then in that same year, we were lucky enough to, Boston Pride reached out to us for a partnership, and they asked us to write a little piece in their Pride guide about Charlie. And that was kind of the kick in the pants that we needed to really dig into this history in a more meaningful way. So we put together an advisory committee of the 3 folks I mentioned and several other really smart, thoughtful people who helped us develop and launch our very first specialty tour called Charlie Gibson's Queer Boston, which was, it is a sort of look at Charlie's life and sexuality and sort of how that informed his life and what it was like to be a queer man in Boston in the late 19th, early 20th century. We launched it in June of 2019, the first weekend of Pride. It was a really fun event. We gave a bunch of tours. We had a party. I had one visitor say to me, if I had known there was a gay story here, I would have visited a lot sooner. So I feel like it was really well received by the community that we were hoping to reach. And since then, or it took us a little bit to get this off the ground, but I would say since about 2021, we have been offering the tour monthly. So I want to switch gears here and talk a little, and now that I've sort of given you the context for Charlie and the project, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of issues or challenges that we have thought through as we've been doing this work. And I imagine it will resonate with lots of us here, and we can talk more about them in the Q&A. So the first thing that I think often comes up when you are doing LGBTQ interpretation is a conversation about privacy. And while I think that there is a really meaningful conversation to be had about our responsibility to the historical actors that we interpret, I also think that this objection of privacy gets weaponized as a way to exclude or ignore the history of LGBTQ folks. I also tend to be a little flippant when thinking about this in the context of Charlie Gibson. Here is a man who spent 20 years opening his house to the public and putting labels on his mother's dresses and thinking about how he might curate the bedroom. And so his expectation of privacy to me is a little bit suspect. And also, he wasn't particularly private in his own writing. So this is the first book that he published, Two Gentlemen in Turin. He did write under a pseudonym, so there is that to consider. But it's a lightly fictionalized account of a time he spent in France when he was in his early 20s with a man that he was in a relationship with, the Count de Moni. And I think if you read these quotes, it's not so hard to suss out that they were in a relationship, that he was in love with this person. So I think the thing that gets paired quite a bit with the conversation around privacy is that of proof. Up until recently, all of our evidence for Charlie's identity as a gay man was circumstantial. So family stories, family lore, reading into his own writings, as we just did, reading into the art and the design of the house. And I will say that I actually think that that is more than enough source material to do a very good job doing this kind of interpretive work. However, I would love to sing the praises of Trip Evans, who is an art historian at Wheaton College. He's working on a project about 4 gay men who preserved houses in New England. And his research, which he has generously shared with us, places Charlie squarely and unambiguously in this community of wealthy gay men in Boston. So that has really helped us, get beyond that so-called burden of proof, but it's also just been really fun material to work with. I think our visitors really respond to reading these letters and seeing how frank this subculture was in talking to each other, and it sort of proves there's nothing new under the sun. I also, as I think about privacy and proof in my work, I want to shout out the work of Margaret Middleton, in particular their article Queer Possibility, and I'll put a link in the chat afterwards. Their work has really informed my thinking about these topics. So language. The Gibson House for years used a lot of coded language when talking about Charlie. He was a bohemian, confirmed bachelor, he was eccentric, and visitors were like, do you mean he was gay? And so when we decided we were going to offer a much more cohesive narrative about him, we thought about what was the language and terminology that we wanted to use with our audience. And we settled pretty quickly on gay, and that was partly because it felt clear to the modern visitor. We really wanted to move away from that coded language and that sort of uncertainty. And also because maybe unlike many of the LGBTQ folks that we interpret, Charlie himself is somewhat clear. As far as we know, he only had relationships with men. But we did think about using the word queer as well. And as we were doing this work, I was in conversation with the folks at Pendarvis, which is a historic site in Wisconsin. They interpret the lives of a gay male couple in the 1930s, I believe, and who owned a restaurant together. And they were really kind enough to share their interpretive manual with us. And they specifically decided not to use the word queer because their visitorship, who was largely older gay men, some of whom were contemporaries of the people they were interpreting, heard that word as a slur. And I thought that was really instructive. We ultimately decided that our audience felt differently about that, and that we wanted to kind of reach a younger, more contemporary LGBTQ community. But I will say that on our tour, we talked briefly about this whole sort of our thinking around this and our language choices, and we asked for feedback because we're not going to get it right for everyone, and we really want to hear about that. Okay, before I close, I just wanted to highlight 2 kind of continuing challenges that we are wrestling with and haven't exactly sorted out. Shayla mentioned one of these, and the first is diversity. So Charlie's story is that of a wealthy white man, and his experience is just one slice of the spectrum of queer experience. And, one of our goals on the tour is to really show visitors that there was some fluidity in sexual identification and sexuality in the late 19th century. It's something you do rather than who you are, and that allows for more movement maybe than we are accustomed to seeing in the early 20th century. But Charlie's ability to live relatively openly is due in large part to his privilege. And I think that conversation can sometimes obscure the experience of others, of queer folks of color, of working class folks. And so that is something that we are thinking about and are not exactly sure how to do well. And I'd love to talk about it more. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight is the issue of balance. How much do we center this story and this history in our overall interpretive plan? I think there are some of us at the museum who see Charlie's story and this LGBTQ history that we are interpreting as the heart of the museum, as the thing that makes us distinctive from all the other 19th century house museums that interpret wealthy white folks. On the other hand, I think some of us feel like it is one in maybe a dozen stories that we can tell and tell well: the history of 19th century women, of the service community in Boston, the Irish immigrants, of the building of Back Bay, of the connection of the Gibson House and Boston writ large in the Atlantic slave economy. And so that is an ongoing tension. How do we balance that in the work that we do in our interpretive goals? Okay, I'm going to stop here, but I'm eager to talk more about all this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And Marilyn, you're up next. You are muted also, Marilyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Marilyn Keith Daly with Historic New England, and this is Sarah Orange Jewett House Museum and Visitor Center in South Berwick, Maine, southern Maine, and it's one of 39 Historic New England historic sites across New England. And at Historic New England, we are the oldest and largest regional heritage organization in the country. And our mission is to save and share New England's past for present and future generations, to engage present and future generations. And in that, in 2018, we launched a reinterpretation of the Sarah Orange Jewett House Museum to really focus on Sarah Orange Jewett, particularly the extraordinary life she led, creating a life of artistic and literal freedom for herself in Victorian New England. Her work, largely dismissed by mid-20th century literary criticism, just being rediscovered, and most particularly her decades-long love relationship with Annie Fields. They have become, Sarah Orange Jewett and Annie Fields have become somewhat emblematic of the Boston marriage, the term there, coined by Henry James, but not actually used by him, emanates from his novel, The Bostonians, and two characters therein who some have supposed are modeled on Sarah Orange Jewett and Annie Fields. While it's possible, they are more probably and more predominantly thought to be centered on his own sister, Alice James, and her relationship with Catherine Loring. But the Boston marriage is a good example of the fluidity and the gray areas of the late 19th century relationships. And they were in their most nuts and bolts. They were domestic households, two women living financially independent of a male. Also compounding when we look at the Boston marriages and the range of relationships therein, we have to consider that in the late 19th century, women were considered passively sexual, meaning that women were not looking for sexual relationships. They merely suffered and tolerated them in order for the greater good. So it's a difficult frame. The 21st century to look at the Boston marriage, to look at the Sarah Orange Jewett and Annie Fields relationship, which was, for all intents and purposes, a lesbian relationship, using the guideposts that we used in our research. Historian Blanche Wisen-Cook's statement: women who love women, who choose women to nurture and support and to create a living environment in which to work creatively and independently, are lesbians. We do not know the exact nature of their physical relationship. We also do not know the exact nature of many people's in our lives' physical relationship. But what we do know about them, and the research and the interpretation that we launched at Sarah Orange Jewett House Museum, stems from the preserved letters of Sarah Orange Jewett. And there are hundreds. She wrote hundreds of letters in her life, many of them daily when they were apart, to Annie Fields. And that's another aspect to the wealth of our resources, which is that every year Sarah Orange Jewett returned to South Berwick from their life together and spent that time working, but every day she wrote to Annie. Few of Annie's letters to Sarah Orange Jewett survive. However, there are some, and not only those, but letters to friends and family, from friends and family, about them, as well as to and from them. Their relationship, Annie Fields and Sarah Orange Jewett, really began and really is, in its essence, originates from books, the written word. Sarah Orange Jewett called herself a wild child. She said of herself that she was the last wild thing left in the fields. And all her life, and you can see this plainly in her writing, nature was a major factor. She needed nature. She needed the solace. She needed the inspiration and the connection. She canoed in this very river here in southern Maine. She walked the woods with her dogs. She rode her beloved horse, Sheila, here. And she hated school. But Sarah Orange Jewett was a voracious reader all her life. And while she called herself proud to have been made of Berwick dust, she was educated. That is Sarah on the left, her sister Carrie Center, and her sister Mary on the right. They were very close all their lives. They were called the doctor's girls. Their doctor was Theodore Jewett. They were the daughters of a very prosperous, granddaughters of a very prosperous merchant. So this was an affluent family, an educated family, and a family of readers. As Sarah Orange Jewett is growing into, from girlhood to adulthood, she's struggling, and we see this over and over again in her diaries. She's struggling with traditional female roles in society. She goes to attend her cousin Helen Gilman's wedding, and she compares it to a death, and is inexplicably saddened by her cousins being wed. She writes in her diary, after Helen Williams Gilman was no more, they went up and congratulated her. She pictures herself famous and writes in her diary about the possibility that some young girl will be reading admiringly in her diary in 100 years, as she gives her a name, Phoebe, and decides to write to her about her life. She has a circle of friends from Boston, Newport, Rhode Island, one in particular, Kate DeCosta Burkhead of Newport, Rhode Island. And she has a series of romantic attachments with young women her age, her peers. These extend from flirtations to the exchange of rings. With Kate DeCosta Burkhead, her diaries around 1871 are really riddled with frustration and longing and wanting to be able to express herself. At one point, Kate DeCosta Burkhead comes to visits Sarah Orne Jewett, and Sarah hears her voice and she's overcome on the stairs because she longs to see her so much. She writes of a social event where she's talking to Kate DaCosta Burkhead, and a young gentleman comes and takes her away, and the frustration of that. At the same time, she is not writing about young gentlemen in her diary at all. She goes through a series of depressions, and what lifts these depressions, really two depressions, is her writing. Her writing, she begins to be published, and that purposefulness really begins to move her life forward. She is published, her second story, Mr. Bruce, is published in the Atlantic Monthly. Atlantic Monthly is published by Tickner and Fields in Boston, and the Fields of that is James T. Fields, husband of Annie Fields. Annie Fields, like Sarah Orne Jewett, is the daughter of a affluent family, affluent Boston family, the daughter of a physician. And she is the daughter in a progressive family, the sixth of 7 children. I believe, I do not know, so it's conjecture. I believe this could be her in the portrait, but it's not proved. She receives an education in the classics and science and history, and she becomes very well-rounded. And she really prizes that education. She grows up to become a beautiful young woman, written about by the peers and friends for her beauty. Marries James Fields. She is his second wife. His first wife died. 2 years after they marry, they purchase 148 Charles Street. And there they become the epicenter of the Boston literary and arts world. Henry James called 148 Charles Street the Waterside Museum of the Fields. And here it really is a who's who of 19th century greats. Dickens, enamored of Annie Fields, Longfellow, Emerson, Hawthorne, Henry James, whom she mentored. Thackeray, John Greenleaf Whittier, there were musicians, actors, Edwin Booth. The list really is extensive. And these people are gathering here. And Annie Fields is really helping her husband in his position as you know, the most important publisher in the country at the time. She's noted for her beauty. She's noted as being a brilliant hostess, witty, funny, engaging. But Annie Fields has a serious side. She's a poet. She's a writer. She later on writes the letters, collects the letters of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is very invested in social causes, specifically women's suffrage, women's education, the ability for women to attend medical school, and assistance for Boston's poor. During this time, Sarah Orne Jewett's writing is taking off. She publishes her first novel, Deep Haven, and is starting to enter this rarefied world of the Fields and 148 Charles Street. And she's introduced to Annie Fields, which is quite exciting to her. And at that time, she is writing very civil and polite notes to Annie Fields. Dear Mrs. Fields, I do hope to be in Boston again, and I should dearly like to make you a little visit. With kindest regards to Mr. Fields, yours most affectionately, Sarah Orne Jewett. 5 months after that letter is written, James Fields dies suddenly at 148 Charles Street, and Annie Fields is shattered and devastated. This was a very happy marriage and an affectionate marriage. She withdraws from society, and 6 months later, Sarah Orne Jewett pays her a condolence call. At that time, a condolence call would last about 3 weeks, 1 to 3 weeks. Sarah Orne Jewett stays 3 months essentially forever. She stays there. They become a couple. They become known as a couple, accepted as a couple, referred to as a couple. And only in the following spring does she return back to South Berwick and immediately is writing Annie letters. She misses Annie. This is actually the second floor of Sarah Orne Jewett House Museum on the left, and that's Sarah Orne Jewett's writing desk. And here she writes in this letter of that spring, a very different kind of letter to Annie Fields. Are you sure you know how much I love you? If you don't know, I cannot tell you. But I think of you and think of you, and I am always being reminded of you. I am yours most lovingly, SOJ. They have nicknames for each other, Pinny and Fuff, and they have a world that is centered at 148 Charles Street, with Sarah returning to South Berwick, Maine in the spring to work, to write. They have a circle and a community of artists, friends, Henry James and Celia Thaxter, Sarah Wyman Whitman, artists and writers, and salons on Saturday afternoons and soirees and breakfasts. But this is a reminder that this relationship was for them both freeing so that they could pursue their careers. They had such respect for each other. We see this in their letters. They had admiration for each other and supported each other's work. Sarah Orne Jewett's writing flourishes during this time. She writes 2 years into their relationship, what is considered a frankly feminist novel, A Country Doctor, in which a young woman pursues a medical career and rejects a perfectly reasonable, eligible bachelor an offer of marriage to pursue her career. Annie Fields writes during this period a letter to Sarah in which she talks first about her frustrations at this meeting and the social work that she's trying to do and trying to make progress, but then switches topics very suddenly in the letter to talk about Sarah Orne Jewett's novel, Marsh Island, which had been selling so well. She switches gears. Luck news, the Marsh Island was all sold. Ah me, is that not beautiful? Can we be happy enough? Sarah continues to really flourish as a writer, and in 1895 writes her masterpiece, The Country of the Pointed Firs. Here we see this community of women that has become an echo of Sarah's own life, and the community of women that anchor her, at the center of which is her partnership with Annie Fields. It's not all work. There's much joy that we see in the letters between Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. In 1883, Sarah Orne Jewett writes to Annie Fields, I shall be with you tomorrow, your dear birthday. How I am looking forward to Thursday evening. I don't care whether there is starlight or a fog. I am tired of writing things. I want now to paint things and dry things and kiss things. Good night and God bless you, dear love. There are numerous letters between them that are like the married couple's shorthand, errands, please do this. Where is this? I can't find this. You left your blouse here. They're very much a shorthand of a couple. There are letters of admiration and respect. One from Sarah Orne Jewett. She has just been reading Annie Fields' collection of poetry. That's Annie Fields depicted on the right there. Sarah's just been reading her collection of poems Under the Olive. And she writes And when I think it was my dear little Fuffy who wrote it, it seems quite amazing. It is like remembering that I have dared to talk nonsense and hug and play generally with something that turned itself into a whole world full of thoughts and sights and beautiful things. From him. This scene here depicted is Manchester by the Sea, where Annie Fields had a summer home and where she and Sarah spent their summers. Sarah would arrive from South Berwick at some point in the early summer. Annie Fields would make a very large effort packing up the house in Boston to travel there, and they would spend their summers there. They traveled to Europe. They traveled within the United States. They once went to Florida for Annie's health. And this painting, by Sarah Wyman Whitman, who was a very close friend of theirs, very much worthy of being looked up. She was at the forefront of the arts and crafts movement and designed the book covers for Sarah Orne Jewett books. If you can see the top of your screen, which I have to move people a little bit to do, you can see that portrait, that landscape painting is over the mantle in Sarah Orne Jewett's room. This is in 1931, when the house became property of Historic New England. The family had preserved Sarah Orne Jewett's room because she was a household name at that time. She was a very famous writer. And Historic New England has carried that forward, and her room is largely unchanged from how she had it, her collection of things very much on display the way she had them. And you'll see, of course, that right in the center of things, as it is in the parlor of the house, as it is in another chamber in the house, the portrait of Annie Fields, and a second portrait next to it, the one we just saw in Manchester. So there are a few clues in the room too. A placement of mirrors that puzzled Historic New England staff. And while we were working on the house, a Jewett scholar visited and really proposed this odd mirror that doesn't seem to have a good purpose in its placement in the corner of the room. She noted that if you were about Sarah's height, you would see Annie's picture reflected in that mirror. And so very possibly you would be, Sarah Orne Jewett could stand in that room and see Annie from any angle. So we do not know the exact nature of their physical relationship, and we never will. We know that there was some evidence of physical affection in Sarah's letters. We know there certainly was love, that they were committed to each other, they cared for each other, they supported each other in career, in success, and also in illness, and that they, shared a deep love. And with that, I will stop sharing. And thank you. Cool.
Oh, yes, thank you, Marilyn, and welcome to Dr. Ferentinos, who is our next speaker.
Well, hello, everybody. And thank you to my fellow speakers for fascinating presentations. And I am really looking forward to our conversation as a group. And with that in mind, I may abridge some parts of my talk just to allow enough time for what I'm sure will be a great conversation. So to remind everyone, I am the historian who was hired by the Stowe Center to further the research begun by Sam Dinny into what we might be able to find out about Katharine Seymour Day. Day was born in 1870. She is the grandniece of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she's considered the founder of the Stowe Center by preserving the house. Excuse me. She also had a fascinating life in which she traveled the world and studied art and psychology and was very instrumental in historic preservation. And she never married. So as Beth mentioned at the beginning, this project investigating Day's sexual identity began with research fellow Sam Dinny, who combed the archives, compiled a body of relevant materials related to the question, and wrote up findings. And I want to make clear in this presentation that the research I'm presenting is very much joint research done by both Sam and I was brought on after Sam's fellowship to further the research a little bit, but that was very much standing on their shoulders as we went forward. So one of the areas that I think I will just gloss very lightly over in this talk is the larger historical context in which Katharine Day lived, although I do think it's very important and important to this whole afternoon event that we're having, because there's a lot of chronological overlap in these stories. But as many of us already know, and as we could easily spend a semester college course discussing in depth, the late 19th century was a time of rapid urbanization in the country, and that brought on a lot. It was like a domino effect of a lot of other important social changes that in turn caused a lot of anxiety among the people that have traditionally held power in this society. So rapid urbanization brings a lot of social problems, makes extreme poverty evident in the cities. The urban infrastructure cannot keep up with the influx of the population. And so, you know, it's a rough time in the urban centers of the US. And this prompts a spirit of reform, the progressive era. And new fields of study and new professions develop in response to this. We have the start of professional social work, of urban planning, of public health. The fields of psychology and sociology develop at this time. And this in turn creates a significant increase in middle-class employment, including middle-class employment for women who, this is kind of like Katharine Seymour Day's generation, the women born in the 1870s and 1880s, to a large extent are the first generation of women in US history who face the possibility of being able to support themselves financially, independent of men, in a way that is not extreme poverty, pretty much. I mean, certainly women were working before the end of the 19th century, but it was a dire, it wasn't a good life they were necessarily looking for, financially speaking, looking forward to. So this entry of women into the workforce, this entry of women into reform efforts, you know, some of which were paid, some of which were volunteer efforts, but led to a cultural trope that began in the 1890s called the new woman. And new women expected to contribute to society, expected to be part of public life. They tended to be educated. The general cultural trope assumed whiteness. the new women were white. There are, like, in reality, women that fit this bill also were of other races and to a lesser extent of other classes. And because of all this flux going on, women entering the professions, they're becoming more educated, all these new types of people are coming together in the cities. The era also develops an obsession with classifying people and classifying categories of people, putting civilizations on, like putting cultures on scales of civilization from savagery to like high cultural attainment, which of course is just so much a product of that time and the biases and prejudices of this time. Also in this era, you see the invention of homosexuality as like a character trait, as opposed to simply behavior as it had been understood in the past. And incidentally, a point that is often overlooked is that this is as part of inventing homosexuality, they needed a binary, right? Like, so if homosexuality is deviant, they needed to like define the norm as well. So the concept of heterosexuality didn't really exist before the late 19th century in the United States as well. And again, these concepts originally are really infused with the prejudices of the time, and particularly the prejudices of the group who's most likely to be entering these new professions or these new fields of study, which are wealthy whites with power in society. So this is the general context, but I think for the purposes of this talk, the more interesting thing that I can offer today is to discuss the specific evidence that that Sam found and that I found in my follow-up work. And I should emphasize at this point that that this project is in a very different stage than the other efforts that we've heard about earlier. This is still in its relatively early stages, and I just did my research a couple months ago, right? So it hasn't moved into the Stowe Center's interpretation yet, but that's actually kind of an exciting time, right? Because the world is full of possibility at this point, right, with this project. So just a quick mention, the next slide does involve nudity, if that is of concern to anyone. So there's kind of 4 clusters of evidence within Day's records. And one is her artistic career to some extent. She was an artist. She studied art for multiple years in different places. Twice she spent periods of time in Paris to study art. She spent a period of time in New York City to study art. These are hotbeds of early 20th century artistic worlds. They are also hotbeds of early 20th century gay subcultures or homosexual underworlds, if you will. And there's a lot of overlap between these two subcultures. I saw in an earlier presentation the code word of bohemian to describe, like that may be used as a code word to describe someone who today we would call LGBTQIA plus. And Katharine Day was very much operating in that milieu. I saw earlier there were some staff members from the Demuth Foundation here in the audience, and Charles Demuth, a pretty explicitly, I would describe a pretty explicitly gay modern artist, a contemporary of Catherine Day. They actually were both studying at the same academy, the Académie Julienne in Paris in the early 19-teens. And so all of that I offer as just evidence that Day was not isolated from the possibilities of what her life might entail. There is also this sketch that there's a lot of sketches of nude women in her papers, more sketches of nude women than nude men, which, you know, I'm not an art historian, but that seems like it was easier to find nude models in art schools of that were women. However, this is a very interesting sketch. And there are two naked women, and one woman's head is in a very intimate place with the other one. So I offer it to all of us to ponder what this sketch might or might not be depicting. It does catch one's eye, though, in the research. And another interesting aspect of the cluster of evidence surrounding her art study is that Day refers to her last period of study in Paris as this monumental time in her life. For the rest of her life, she refers back to that time in Paris and the vision that it opened up for her. And she describes wondering about her future and the nature of love and what if her life would include love. So again, nothing definitive, but super interesting, right? Our ears are pricked. Another exciting body of evidence in her papers surrounds a period in 1914 when she was considering a marriage proposal that she had received. And it's very interesting because just to make explicit, she was 44 years old at this point when she received this marriage proposal. And she spent a few months really seriously considering the offer, although in the end she opted not to marry this man. But it produced a lot of personal writing, which is always fun for the historian, particularly the historian of sexuality. And as one example, she is in almost daily conversation with her suitor. And in one situation, in one letter, we have his letters. His name was William Schumacher. We have his letters. We don't have her letters, but so we're guessing at what she's bringing up based on what her correspondents are saying back to her. But she apparently has brought up to her suitor the possibility of two women partnering together for life, which I love to imagine, right? This is probably not how it went down, but like, well, you know, I could marry you, or, you know, I could just like take up with a woman too, and I'm trying to decide between the two, right? So, and he responds back, and we can read this, and it's pretty clearly, you know, we could call it a big dismissal of that possibility, but I find this very fascinating because it reveals a lot. It certainly reveals that both she and her suitor are conversant in the popular and medical thinking about female companionship or couples at the time. He refers to pairings of men and women as being more natural. He refers to the the theoretical female couple as not caring what they wear or how they look, which is important because with this, with the invention of heterosexuality and homosexuality, there's a lot of class connotations, a lot of racial connotations. And so, as earlier speakers said, wealthy white people are kind of, there's a little interlude where whatever they're doing is not understood to be the same thing that like the urban masses in vice districts are doing. However, women who are working, women who are in public life, very much women who are fighting for the vote at this time are often referred to as being mannish. They are striving for privileges that have previously been reserved for men. And so that's another one of these code words that is more often used with to cast aspersions on basically feminist activity or aspirations. And so the do not care what they wear or how they look is a suggestion that like, oh, these women are sort of outside of gender standards for the time, and that is like cause to dismiss them. And also he mentions that such women would have less to fulfill, that their lives would be less fulfilling. So very interesting. That body of evidence kind of melds into a larger body of evidence in the day records, which is the letters from her dear friend, Emily Skeel. And I adore the letters from Emily Skeel. I have devoted a large part of my career to reading women's personal writings, either in diaries and correspondence. And it is very clear from the surviving letters that Skeel and Day were really close, lovely friends. Their letters are not imbued with romance. I don't really think there's a question that they were romantically involved, but they're just confidants. Whereas so much letters of the early 20th century are all about logistics, right? Like, we're traveling here and then we'll be there, and maybe this summer we'll be in this town and we'll run into you there, and you know, that can get tedious, but they're actually talking about real stuff. And there's numerous examples in Emily's letters of what appears to be discussions of references to homosexuality, teasing Catherine Day for her unconventional beliefs, and kind of talking kind of tepidly about marriage. And one letter in particular, written today while she's trying to decide in 1914 whether to marry Schumacher or not, she writes this letter, which suggests that Catherine's last letter had some very intense confession in it, or the sharing of secrets. And it could mean different things. It could mean that she just wasn't that into Schumacher, but was thinking of marrying him anyway. Or it could mean that she was saying, I maybe don't know if I'm going to marry Schumacher because I would much prefer to be with women. And then finally, very quickly, in the latter part of her life, when Catherine Day is 60 years old in 1930, she begins a very close friendship with another woman in Hartford, Inez Temple. And that close friendship continued until Temple's death in 1945. So it went on for 15 years. And they're very affectionate letters from Temple to Day. We don't have her correspondence, but we know that Day takes her to Paris, to this place that was a monumental period of her life. And so that's telling. At the same time, they never lived together. And Emily Skeel Day's really close correspondent rarely mentions Temple in her letters to Day, which suggests that maybe Skeel didn't see this as a singular relationship. So that question still remains. So just as a little sampler pack, there's certainly more evidence than that, but I feel like this is really illustrative of a lot of times what you find when you're looking for LGBTQIA plus identities in the archives, right? You see you see things that catch your eye, things that maybe seem a tad queer in the 19th century connotation of that word, but it is often not super clear what it all means when it's put together. So I would say the next step for this project, if funding is found, is that there is more research to be done. All of these bodies of evidence and this fascinating stuff is happening in Day's middle age. It's all happening in the from like 1910 onward, and she's 40 in 1910. And that's very refreshing in and of itself. But one does wonder, like, did she have other marriage proposals in her youth when it was the standard time to get married? It seems like she would have received proposals, just if nothing else, given her family's wealth. The other thing is to try to find more of Day's voice. We're kind of surmising what she was saying based on what her correspondents are writing back to her. But we do know that some of her letters survive in Emily Skeel's papers, which are in New York City. And as everyone's been talking about, I think we're all aware that the House Museums of New England very disproportionately favor a certain class of society. And in Day's case, she had an amazing life for a single woman that like she traveled all over the world. She's traveling through like Egypt on her own. And it raises the question of how she managed to do that, and what elements of her wealth and her standing in society enabled that, or made aspects of remaining unmarried more difficult. And finally, just trying to engage some of the newer scholarship in LGBTQIA plus history about what we can learn by what we can't see, like reading the silences in the historical record and where that might take us in the case of Catherine Day. But even at this moment in time, there's really exciting possibilities from what we already know. Even though what we already know is not everything we might hope to know, the possibilities are there, because I would argue very strongly that any historical interpretation that challenges the heteronormative framing that we so often find at historic sites is relevant to to queer history and is relevant to queer audiences. And we definitely know that Day was ambivalent at best about heterosexuality, and that she was actively engaging people in a conversation about what her possibilities for love and her future were. And I think that in and of itself is a fascinating story, and one that I think totally counts as part of our larger LGBTQIA plus interpretive effort. So with that, I'll wrap up.
Susan, thank you so much. That was so great. And I am going to bring our other speakers forward and add spotlights here. I'm inspired by all of your words and all of the work that you've shared today. Before we bring Sam forward to moderate Q&A from our conversations with our larger audiences, and please just let me reiterate to everyone, you may put your questions in the chat to me, and I will be sharing those with Sam appropriately. And I wanted to give a moment for our presenters to sort of be in conversation with each other. Anything resonating for you all as a result of hearing each other's talks today?
If I might go first, I would say two things really resonated with me, like gave me insight into this project that I have been engaged with the Stowe Center. And one, I think it was Shaylin who said that like a foundational principle is that this work will not have a completion. Like it will never be done and over with and we have all the answers. And I think that is definitely reality. Like whether or not, whatever the foundational principle is, but I love that is just built in, right? That there is always more to learn. There is always new insight and new scholarship coming out. So, and I loved that. And then I believe it was Megan who you sort of posited Charlie's preservation work as being his legacy to his family because he wasn't producing heirs. And that really resonated with me because we have Catherine Day, who also is not producing heirs and who is memorializing, not just memorializing the past, but very much memorializing a major figure in her family, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that's a really interesting, that seems like something that may be a familiar concept in New England museums, but I work more nationally and less in New England, and I love that. That gives me so many things to ponder with a lot of my different projects, because so many people that resonate with us as queer were indeed involved in historical enterprises of one way or another.
Yeah, I would, if I can respond to that, I find that really interesting too, where, you know, 3 of the 4 of us are talking about folks who founded a site. And I was at a conference a couple of years ago and someone was presenting about queer interpretation at historic house museums. And they were saying, I can't remember their site or their name, I'm sorry, but they were saying that, you know, for a lot of queer folks, the relationship to home and family is really fraught and complex. And I find it an interesting thing to see these people preserving homes. I think it's a little bit different for Frederick because this is not his family homestead, but still to see these people thinking about how they memorialize their family, which could or could not have been also a complex relationship. Certainly for Charlie Gibson, I think it was.
And we have
Sarah Onchuit actually, but does belong in this collection. I mean, there is wallpaper in the house that is pre-Revolutionary War because Sarah and her sister preserved that wallpaper, but also she was very instrumental in the preservation of nearby Hamilton House, a site that she loved, and went on a mission to find a buyer so it was not developed. So.
And we have that, I mean, we have the good fortune to be able to look at multiple properties and how they came into our organization. And in a lot of cases, the last generation, the generation that was responsible for giving the property to us, didn't have children. And so in many cases, we don't necessarily have at this moment, right? Like we are still doing research into those folks. So we don't necessarily have evidence of any queer identities for those houses, right? But we do see like this network. So I mentioned that Frederick was responsible for the acquisition of several of our properties. we have found, and we are only just beginning this work, we have found so many connections between the families who lived in our houses, right? And that's in the period just before they came into the possession of the organization, and also going way back into like the colonial era. And that has to do with whose houses are being preserved, right? Like that's a given, but it is really, really interesting to kind of be able to see that and to chart that and to understand how people were finding value in these relationships, finding ways to preserve their homes, finding ways to preserve their families' homes, that we have in other places where we, in some cases, are looking for additional evidence about their personal relationships and identities. And we may have our suspicions based on what we've been able to research so far, but it's all tied up in that. It's so interesting to me.
I find one thing that I find a pattern, and it's been on my mind and concern for the future of research, and that is the importance of letters to all of these interpretations. And what happens next, I do wonder, with coming generations. Will that be lost? Will that primary source material be lost?
You're going to be doing a lot of digital archiving.
Right. One thing that I thought was really interesting that came up is, and Susan, I really loved how you closed about this idea of any interpretation that challenges sort of the heteronormative narrative, and maybe especially with Sarah Orange Jewett and Catherine Seymour Day, they themselves are really chafing against these traditional roles, and that maybe is part of their identity, but also just might be a way of being different in their moment in time. And I find that a really interesting piece of this conversation that feels maybe even stronger for the women in the group, but I don't know, but it feels an important thread.
I think that is, yes, I guess amplify that, because I think that this is an era, it's probably true for a lot of eras, but certainly in this one where I tend to spend a lot of time at the turn of the 20th century, the prospects of a woman marrying a man comes with a whole lot of expectations and roles and deference to a new person in their life. And I think that filled a lot of women with ambivalence. And I think that is not at all irrelevant to other things, including female pairings that we see in the early 20th century. I don't think I ended up saying it in my talk, but in the decade of the 1890s, 10% of women in the US remained unmarried, but of women that had college degrees, that statistic jumps to 50%. So that may be because they had college degrees, they were able to consider not marrying for financial dependence, but it also suggests that maybe the social problems of the age were calling to them more than the kind of the traditional role of wife, which almost certainly brought also the role of mother. You know, there was like childlessness by choice wasn't, I mean, there were certainly childless couples in this era, but it wasn't really okay to just be like, yeah, we don't want to have kids, you know? So, yeah. So I think the heavy burden that came with heterosexual marriage for American women is definitely part of this story.
Yeah, fascinating.
Sam, I've added you to the mix here. If you would resonate with themes and or certainly bring forward some of the comments from our visitors. We're going to spend another 10 minutes together. I thank you all for staying extra for this talk. It's amazing. And those of you who can't stay, just know that our multimedia gallery will hold the content.
Yeah, so thank you to our panelists. All your presentations were fantastic. And just thank you for the Stowe Center for bringing me back here. It's been great to re-engage with some LGBTQ history. So we have some really interesting questions in the chat. One came from Olivia based off of Susan, your comments about silence in the archives. And also I know some recent LGBTQ interpretation has been interpreting like marginal spaces in historic houses as well. So the question, Olivia would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on the possibilities for bringing these silences to life through art, creativity, or imagination, moving beyond what is in the archives or using small details to recreate what these lives might have been like through art or other like objects. Could you see these historic houses using these methods? So I know some of you touched upon this already, but maybe if you want to elaborate on that.
I can speak a little bit to that. I think that I think that a lot of us who work in the history field are thinking a lot about queer possibility, to borrow a phrase from Margaret Middleton, in the historic house space, right? But we've also been doing this work in other areas. So at Connecticut Landmarks, we have a site that has one of the best documented lives of an enslaved person in colonial America. Unfortunately, we don't have his perspective. We have the story of his life as told by the person who enslaved him. And so in order to interpret his life, we have to kind of fill in those gaps. We have to read between the lines. We have to take small things that the person who enslaved him wrote about and try to imagine his perspective, imagine his life with respect for his lived experience that we don't have documented. And so I think that there is so much work being done in interpretation, in interpreting silences in the archive, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? We can learn from all of the incredible work that's been happening over the decades and just continually push forward. And I think that one of the ways that you can do that while I think one of the other challenges is that historic house museums, because they are period rooms, because you are entering a complete space often, or what feels like a complete space, is that visitors tend to think that they are just authentic without questioning it. And so I think part of this conversation is being really explicit about what we know and what we don't know and where we are filling in gaps. And that, I think, is an incredible opportunity for art and for imagination and these other ways of expressing the human experience to help us. And so I think all of this, just being more transparent about what we know, how we know it, what kind of work we're doing every day, helps us to then engage other modes of storytelling.
And within, I tend to, like, as soon as I hear that somebody's personal correspondence was destroyed, like some historical figure whose other papers made it into the archive, like, I actually like consider that evidence, right, of something, like not a smoking, not like we have no more questions to ask, but it is so common among historical figures who are widely understood to have had romantic relationships with their own sex. And the question, I think, also involved using creative efforts to address the holes in the archives. And I love that. And I must, if anyone has read my book, I don't think I speak against art, like creative interpretation at all in the book, but I do feel like since the book has come out, my thinking on this has changed quite a bit, in no small part because many of the people that are in the audience and conversations I've had with them, client work I've done, or their writings that I've read. But I think that it is likely to make traditionally trained historians, like I am, a little nervous, because well, we have to say what's happened and what we're making up. But at the same time, artistic expression is such a way to create empathy and capture people's imagination. And I think ultimately that is what we're trying to do in the world of public history as well. We're trying to create empathy and engage people's imagination with relation to the past. And so I now love artistic interpretation in a historic space. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I really like all your points and some of the words you threw out, like creativity, imagination, and expression, because Susan, sort of going back to the point you made, is doing queer interpretation is breaking this heteronormative mold, and you can't do that with the conventional means of museum interpretation. So you do have to get creative and imaginative. So we have another question sort of going off of the issue of privacy that Megan brought up. So how do we interrupt a person's life who asked that their writings, photos, etc. be destroyed on their deaths, so as to not one could interrupt their lives? Such is the case of a trans man, Dr. Alan Hart. So in other words, how do we balance honoring a person's own wishes and interpreting the very important LGBTQ history that we can tell through their story? So balancing the personal with sort of our professional goals, and just connecting the past to a very relevant present for the LGBTQ community.
I don't know that I have the greatest answer for it, but I will say that one framework that I try to use is, how would we treat this if this was a story about a heterosexual person? And so if we can apply whatever standard we might apply there could potentially apply here. But this particular one, I don't know, and I would love to hear what other folks think.
So it's not totally analogous here at Palmer Warner House, but we have had, because Howard only passed away in 2005, and because even Frederick is a relatively recent person, they are both still in living memory. And so we have been grappling with the issues of privacy that folks have brought up, and they did not expect their relationship to be part of the primary interpretation of the site. They expected Frederick's career to be, they expected the house to be, but they were coming at it from a totally different perspective than the way that we've approached the house. And so where we are right now is that we are choosing to make materials, their personal archives, available for research, right? Like we are not shutting off access to it, but we are also not publishing the letters that they wrote to each other that contained explicit material that was only ever intended for the eyes of the other person. At this point, they are still very close to the present, and so that feels like a respectful way to handle that navigation. And that will be an evolving conversation as we move away in time, as the context changes. We're going to just keep talking about it and keep feeling it out and talking to family members and things like that. So that's how we're handling it. But it is a huge challenge, and I think as much as it depends so much on the individuals and the specific cases in each situation.
Yeah, I think the question gets at how deeply personal interpreting LGBTQ history is, just because of the marginalization of these identities, and also because we have to pull out all these threads. Everybody's talking about reading the silences, and it's like there's a lot there that you have to parse through, and there's so many considerations that do make it difficult. So on that note, and I know we'll be wrapping up here soon, Andy asked, what advice or resources would you suggest for other historic house museums approaching these topics? And maybe as you discuss some of that advice or resources, maybe include some of the challenges or some of the really fun things that have come out of the work that you're doing, because I feel like with queer history, we often say, oh my God, this is so difficult and challenging, but it's good to share the wins too and show people the ups and downs that we can have with this work and how fulfilling it can be if you put the time and energy into working with these resources in the community.
One thing that if you're lucky enough to have somebody that is recent is to have oral histories, which are phenomenally helpful, and recordings of those, which I don't think, that would be something in the last recent history.
Yeah, it was a little unclear if it's like tips for investigating further or resources for like case studies of other museums or not. But I would, with the latter, I would say there are two special issues that have been very helpful to me in my work. Is the journal, The Public Historian, had a special issue on LGBTQ public history. I think it was 2018, it might have been 2019. And at various times, they make that special issue available for free, the publisher, which is University of California Press. So it's worth checking back every once in a while. I don't know what prompts them to make it public access for a few months, but it happens. And then the journal change over time. If you're more in the historic preservation end of things, change over time looks at change in the built environment. And they had a special issue on LGBTQ landscapes and historic preservation. And I believe that journal is always open access. So they're, so they're not behind paywalls, but I found them both helpful because they're basically, as special issues of journals are, they're kind of a conversation among various people working in the field. And so you get, like, in quick succession, lots of different perspectives.
We give Susan's book to our guides, and it's really wonderful. So that's been a really helpful resource for us.
Thank you.
There's a whole element too of, when the interpretation is done and you are presenting the information, one of the, I think, important aspects is the front line. If you have guides who are interpreting this material for your public, and really important for that training to be really good and thorough. And I always suggest to people that you have you find a member of the LGBTQ community, a nonprofit, somebody who is out there in the public and dealing with issues, to come in and talk to your staff about language, about wordage, and some of the important aspects of interpreting LGBTQIA+ history.
And if I can point out something that Amy just put in the chat for me as you guys were talking about this, I just remembered I was an intern with the American Association for State and Local History this past summer, and I put together a resource kit on interpreting LGBTQ history. And Susan features very prominently in this resource kit that I put together. It's a list of some of the resources that AASLH has in their resource center. It has some webinars about oral histories. It has some examples of exhibitions. It has guides, further readings, museums dedicated to LGBTQ history, some case studies. So the link is in the chat, and you can take a look at some of that. It has hyperlinks to a lot of things too, if you want to check it out. I had a lot of fun making it, and I'm glad I can finally share it with an audience who's very interested in doing some LGBTQ interpretation. So I hope it's helpful to anybody who's looking to start this work or is at any point in doing the work and always continuing it, because as Shaylin said, it's never done. We're always going to be continuing with this. And that's what makes it super fun, right? We always have stuff to do.
Such a great place to end with that new resource kit, Sam. Thank you so much. And really, I've learned 100 things. It supports my theory that if you want to know something at your museum, start designing public programming around it, because it really helps. It's like, oh, you have an excuse to assemble the best minds and projects and ideas around the topic, and then we learn alongside our audiences. So it's, again, been a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much for being generous with the Stowe Center today, and keep being generous with your interpretation as well.